everyone. Welcome back to Terrors at Twilight with Miss Cheryl. Tonight's reading is Bone Diggers by Roberta Simpson Brown. Lori Simmons didn't really want to babysit for the Wilsons that Friday night, even though they lived on a quiet street in a respectable neighborhood. Lori felt uneasy there for several reasons. It bothered her that the Wilsons sometimes argued in front of her. Mrs. Wilson always seemed nervous and worried about her dog, Digger, would do something to set her husband off. Mr. Wilson didn't like dogs, especially if they lived in the house. Lori felt the Wilsons had little in common except for their son. What disturbed her the most was the fact that her friend Barbara, who lived on that street, had disappeared last year and no trace of her has ever been found. In spite of her misgivings, Lori felt she owed the Wilsons a favor. They had hired her to babysit their little boy Danny when she needed to earn extra money for school. "My wife and I have to attend a very important business dinner," Mr. Wilson said when he called. "We'll be back early and the neighbors will be home." Lori knew all the neighbors. Old Mrs. Watson lived on one side. Ever since her daughter had died in another town, the Ballards were a middle-aged couple who lived on the other side. It was their daughter who had disappeared. She can count on him if she ever needed any help. "I'll leave Digger inside to keep you company," offered Mr. Wilson. Lori knew that was a big concession on his part. Digger did have a way of getting into mischief. She liked to have him around, though because he always barked at strangers, that made her feel safe. Considering all these positive things, Lori had agreed to take the job. Once she accepted, she began to feel better. She even began to look forward to it. "I can use the extra money," she told herself, "and the evening won't be dull with Digger around." This might even help her deal with her loss of Barbara. She should have gone with her to sell the candy for school that night last year, but she had to stay home and study for a test. She never seen Barbara again. Lori arrived at the Wilsons' house on Friday a little before 6. She said hello to Mrs. Watson, who was cutting a bouquet of roses. "Babysitting tonight?" asked the old woman. "Yes, Mrs. Watson," replied Lori. "Call if you need anything," said Mrs. Watson, going inside with her roses. "Thanks, I will," Lori called after her. As she turned up the walk, Lori could see the Ballards in their living room reading the evening paper in front of the window. They had changed so much since Barbara's disappearance. They looked so lonely now. She felt guilty that she hadn't visited them, but she didn't know how to say how very sorry she was. She knew how much they missed Barbara. She missed her too. Barbara used to come over and keep her company when she babysat for Danny. She'd asked Barbara once why she didn't want the job since it was so close by, but Barbara said she didn't want to be alone there. She never did explain why. The Wilsons were ready to go when Lori arrived. Little Danny was already asleep. Digger looked at her from his favorite place by the chair, thumped his tail, and went to sleep too. "Danny will probably stay asleep until we get back," said Mrs. Wilson. The Wilsons left and Lori sat down in a big chair to watch TV. A scary movie that she'd been waiting to see was on tonight. As she watched, she heard all the creaks and old noises that all houses make as soon as someone is alone. "I've got to control my imagination," Lori thought. "This scary movie will have me thinking all sorts of things." It was too exciting to turn off, so she reached over and patted Digger's head, and he roused up and watched too. The longer Lori sat watching the show, the more she felt that someone was watching her. Through the drawn patio curtains, once the screen was silent, she heard something out there. She was sure it was footsteps. Digger was listening too, but he was quiet. That made her feel better. He'd be barking if somebody strange was prowling around. "I hope the Wilsons stopped leaving the key out on the patio," thought Lori. When a commercial came up, Lori went to the kitchen, made a sandwich. She remembered how she and Barbara used to stuff themselves while they watched scary movies. She wished she could know what happened to Barbara. As Lori opened and closed the refrigerator, she saw the patio door opened and closed quietly, too. She felt like bolting out the back door and running for help. But she forced herself to look into the living room. She heard a soft thump, and that sounded familiar. "It's Digger thumping his tail," she laughed. She checked the patio door just to be certain, and it was securely locked. Lori pulled herself a Coke, grabbed her sandwich, and rushed back to the living room just as the movie came back on. For the next few minutes she sat completely absorbed in it. Digger went back to sleep close to the patio door. During the commercial, Lori went back to the kitchen to clean up after her snack. She wiped off the tray she used and ran water to rinse her glass. As she turned the faucet off, she heard something walking in the living room. Digger must be awake, she said aloud. The soft footsteps crossed to the stairs. Lori was sure of it. But why would Digger be going upstairs? She didn't think she had the courage to look this time, but she made herself do it. There was nothing there. If Barbara were around, I'd swear she was playing tricks on me, thought Lori. She wished she had someone to talk to. She was getting a bad case of the jitters. The phone rang at the same instant, and Lori nearly screamed at the sudden noise. It was her mother calling to see if everything was all right. I'm fine, Lori assured her. Just a little jumpy. Are the neighbors home? Inquired her mother. Yes, said Lori, but I think the Ballards have gone to bed. Mrs. Watson told me to call if I needed anything. I would count too much on that poor old thing, her mother advised. After her daughter died, Mrs. Watson used to get confused and call Barbara by her daughter's name. Mrs. Wilson says she forgets that and leaves the gate open and then complains if Digger gets into her roses. Don't worry about me, said Lori. Call me if you need us, said her mother. She hung up, feeling much better. The feeling didn't last but a few seconds. Right above her head was a terrible noise she couldn't identify. Bump, 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 bump. It's Danny, she thought. He must have fallen out of bed. She ran from the kitchen, raced up the stairs, 2 at a time, and jerked open the nursery door. From the sound of the bumping, she expected to see the little boy sprawled on the floor or some mysterious intruder bent on harming him. There was neither. Danny was sleeping peacefully in his bed. Through the open window came the strong scent of Mrs. Watson's roses. Lori ran to the window to see if someone had tried to climb inside, but there was nothing to indicate that. There was no breeze to blow anything down. Nothing. The room was out of place. What could have made a noise like that and disappeared? A ghost, she asked aloud. She regretted she asked the question. The window fell by itself with a bang, and the room grew icy cold. Even though her eyes told her otherwise, she had the unshakable feeling that she and Danny were not alone in the room. She promised herself that tonight she'd never ever babysit here again. She forced herself to look in each room and closet before she left Danny in his bed and went downstairs. No wonder Barbara had never wanted to be alone there. She was nearly to the bottom step when the noise started again, right beside her. Bump, 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 bump. Why isn't Digger barking, she thought. He's got to be able to hear this. Maybe he doesn't hear it, but maybe it's familiar. Maybe it's just pipes banging somewhere in the house. When she reached the bottom step, the scent of roses filled the house. There was nothing out of place downstairs, so she must be right about the noise coming from the plumbing. Digger stretched and yawned and looked up at her. Then he walked to the patio door and scratched to get out. Lori pulled the curtain and looked out. Nothing was moving in the yard. She opened the door and let Digger out, instructing him to make his bathroom break a short one. She waited for the door, but Digger did not return. She called to him just as she heard Mrs. Watson's voice, shrill and angry. Get out of my roses, you bad dog! Get! Before Lori could call again, Digger raced by her with something in his mouth. Lori turned to apologize to Mrs. Watson, but her door slammed shut. Lori gave her attention to Digger to see what he'd dragged into the house. He was in front of the TV again, guarding his new possession between his paws. What have you got there, Digger? Lori asked. Digger gave an obligatory growl as she took it from him and examined it. It was a bone of some kind. She had never seen one like it, but it must have been buried in Mrs. Watson's rose garden for some time. Perhaps she should call Mrs. Watson and apologize for letting Digger out. As she reached for the phone, it rang. This time it was Mr. Wilson calling. Is everything all right, Lori? My wife wanted me check on Danny, he said. Danny's fine, said Lori. Digger is in a bit of trouble with Mrs. Watson, though. When I let him out for the bathroom, he dug up one of his bones from her flower bed. I don't think she was happy that he was in her roses. I was just going to call and apologize. Don't bother. I'll take care of it, he said. We'll be home soon. Lori thought his voice sounded funny. She hoped he wouldn't be angry. It probably wouldn't be better to let him handle it. It really wasn't any of her business anyway. She sat on the floor by Digger and looked at the bone again. It looked like one of her biology book. She and Barbara had studied biology together just last year. Bump, 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 bump. The sound came rapidly together. The air was filled with the smell of roses again. All she could think of was Barbara. I must be going crazy, she thought. Here I am, sitting on the floor, looking at a human bone that a dog dug up from a rose garden, and I'm thinking of Barbara. What she was thinking just couldn't be true. She didn't believe in ghosts, but maybe Barbara was trying to tell her something. The bumping must be a warning. If it was, then this bone must be from Barbara's arm. She nearly fainted from the thought. The bone had come from Mrs. Watson's rose garden. That meant that Mrs. Watson had killed Barbara and buried her under the roses. No wonder she didn't want Digger digging in there. A light flashed under the patio curtain. Lori crawled over and peeked out. Mrs. Watson's porch light was on, and Lori could see the old woman bent over her roses with a flashlight in one hand and a small garden spade in the other. Then she turned and ran toward the Wilsons' front door. Mrs. Watson rang the bell, but Lori sat very still and didn't answer. It rang again and again, but Lori continued to sit perfectly still. Maybe she didn't think you were asleep or go away, hoped Lori. At last, Mrs. Watson gave up and hurried back to her house. Lori was weak with relief. She started to phone the Ballards, and then she heard a key in the door. She hoped Mrs. Watson had not found a key outside. She choked back a scream as the door opened and Mr. Wilson came in. "I am so glad to see you," sobbed Lori. He listened as she told him what had happened. "You did the right thing," Lori said. "Have you called anyone to come get you?" "No," said Lori. "Is Mrs. Wilson waiting to drive me home?" "She's in the car," said Mr. Wilson. Lori opened the door and started out, but when she heard him laugh, a low, cold laugh that she never heard from him before, the smell of roses filled the air. "Mrs. Wilson's won't be driving you home, though," he continued. "What are you talking about?" asked Lori. "What do you mean?" "My wife figured everything out tonight, Lori, just like you did. Now she's dead, just like you're going to be." Lori didn't know she could feel such fear and still function. She started to run, but he grabbed her arm and jerked her around. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Why would you kill someone as sweet as Barbara?" "I didn't mean to kill Barbara. My wife and Danny were away visiting. I was lonely. Barbara came to the door selling candy. I asked her in while I got some money. I just wanted her to be nice to me. I just wanted to touch her. She tried to scream when I put my hand on her neck. I had to make her be quiet. I took her head and I beat it against the door casing. I kept it up until she died. Bump, 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 bump. Mrs. Watson was away too, and I was watching her house for her. I buried Barbara under the rose bushes. I didn't think anybody would ever look there." He stopped for a minute far away, look in his eyes. Lori tried to pull away, but he held tighter. "Nobody would have known if it hadn't been for you and that nosy dog," he said. "He took the first bone to my wife, but she didn't know what it was. When she heard us on the phone tonight, she made the connection. She was going to turn me in. I had to kill her, and now I have to kill you." He brought his hands up towards her throat, and the door opened quietly behind him. "Let her go," a voice said. He released Lori and whirled around. Mrs. Watson stood in the doorway holding the knife she had used to cut the roses. Mr. Wilson lunged at the old woman and grabbed her arm. She held tightly to the knife as they struggled. Lori tried to move, but a flash of fur flew by her and sprang into the air. Mr. Wilson yanked the knife from Mrs. Watson's hands as Digger sank his teeth into his master's arm. Mr. Wilson yelled with pain, staggered backwards, lost his balance, and fell on the knife. He lay silent, his eyes wide open with surprise. Mrs. Wilson came to Lori and put her arms around her. "It's all right now, child," she said. "I called the police before I came over." Mrs. Watson helped her to the couch and sat there stunned, listening to the sirens getting louder. Digger licked her face and then ran out to the officers when they arrived. Mrs. Watson explained to the man in uniform that she had discovered more bones when she went to repair the damage Digger had done to her roses. She went to warn Lori, but Lori didn't answer the door. She called, but the line was busy. She rushed home to call the police, but she saw Mr. Wilson come back and go into the house alone. She had known then that Laurie was in terrible danger and that the police might not get there in time to save her. She grabbed her knife and ran to help. They knew the rest. Laurie's parents came to take her home. She saw a policeman putting Danny in the police car. She saw men shoveling dirt from under the rose bushes while the Ballards stood watching and crying. "Thank you for trying to warn me, my friend," Laurie whispered to Barbara. A gentle breeze touched Laurie's face. Once more, she smelled the roses. I hope you enjoyed this story, and see you again. Thank you.
Hi, tonight's chilling tale is going to be Sorry, Froggy, from the collection Out to Get You by Josh Allen and Sarah J. Coleman. Sorry, Froggy. Brady stuffed the last of his pizza bomb into his mouth. Blech, said Julie Simons from across the lunchroom table. You eat like a caveman. Brady opened his mouth and leaned forward and showed Julie his half-chewed food, a mash of crust and pepperoni and cheese. Julie was always going on about blue whales and lost puppies. Making her look at a mouthful of meat was just what she deserved. "You're disgusting," Julie said, and rolled her eyes. Brady didn't care what Julie thought. Pizza bombs were the best thing they made in the cafeteria. You couldn't help but wolf them down. Julie Simmons, the Vegosaurus Rex, would never understand that because she only ate things like tofu and arugula. The weirdo. Besides, Brady wanted to get through lunch as fast as he could. After lunch came biology, and today was the day he longed for since the first day of 7th grade. He was finally going to dissect a frog. That was the whole reason he'd even taken biology in the first place, to dissect things. When he signed up, he imagined himself in a white lab coat and stretchy rubber gloves, cutting out lungs and eyeballs and hearts, and laying them neatly on a table. He figured it'd be a bit like being a mad scientist. But so far, biology hadn't been anything like mad science. It had just been, well, science. There were 2 months into the school year, and he hadn't gotten to dissect anything. Instead, he'd read a long chapters from a thick-spined book called Life in You, which was filled with impossible-to-pronounce words and not nearly enough pictures. And he'd listened to Mr. Go's mind-numbing lectures on the circulatory system, ecosystems, and a dozen other kinds of systems, which always made Brady's eyes droop. And he'd even written 3 essays and taken 2 tests, on which he'd earned a C and a C-. But all that was about to change, because today was Mad Science Day. Everyone was talking about it. "I just don't see what it accomplishes," said Julie Simmons to anyone at the lunch table who would listen. "Cutting up those frogs just so we could learn some dumb lesson? I mean, it's cruel." Brady snorted. Of course, Julie would whine about the frogs. When she walked home from school, she sometimes stopped and talked to the squirrels and birds. "Oh, good morning, Mr. Squirrel. Are you gathering a lot of nuts today?" Brady had seen her do it. And last year, when a huge spider crept down from the whiteboard in Miss Baker's class, instead of just letting Brady squash it, Julia coaxed it onto a blank sheet of paper and released it out the window. Yep, a definite weirdo. "I think I'll take 6, she went on, "to see if I can get out of it." Brady snorted again, louder this time, hoping she'd hear. "You don't have the guts to fake sick," he said, and he knew it was true. Julie might have been an animal-loving tree hugger, but she was also a classic goody two-shoe. She'd do anything to get that A. She wouldn't fake sick if her life depended on it. Julie, Brady figured, was getting exactly the dilemma she deserved. She could dissect the frog and get an A, or she could skip the dissection and get an F. He bet it was the kind of predicament that gave her nightmares. Brady smiled. With 5 minutes still left in the lunch break, he cleared his tray and bolted to the classroom. He was the first one there beside Mr. Goff, who actually was wearing a white lab coat. The old teacher was getting things ready, pulling out silver trays from the supply closet and laying them on each student's desk. The trays were about the size of a rectangular cake that his mom would sometimes bake, and in each tray was a scalpel with a small pointy blade, a pair of white stretchy gloves, and best of all, right in the center of each tray lay a grayish dead frog. The frogs about the size of hockey pucks looked stiff and shriveled. Sweet, Brady whispered to himself. That was when the smell hit him, like chemical pickles. Mr. Goff had warned the students about it the day before. Formaldehyde is a compound used to preserve the frogs, he told them. It's pretty strong. Brady took his seat, and his eyes began to water and his nostrils flared. He rubbed his eyes and breathed the smell away. Mr. Goff placed the tray in front of him. His frog lay belly up, and the soft skin of its underbelly gleamed, reflecting the fluorescent classroom lights. Brady couldn't believe it. Soon he'd get to hold the thing in his hands. He'd get to poke it, wiggle it, dangle it over some girl's head. Preferably Julie Simmons, who sat next to him, in fact. A fact that he also hated most days. But one that would come in handy today. And even better, he would get to slice the frog open, making a straight cut up its chest like Mr. Goff had taught. He'd get to fold back its skin, pluck out its tiny heart, and roll it like a marble between his fingers. He shifted a little in his chair. He couldn't wait. Mad scientist time was coming. Nothing, he thought, could ruin this. Just then, Julie Simmons walked in. "Ew," Julie said. Taking her seat next to Brady, she plucked her nose, and her face was the color of cooked pasta. "This smells awful." She made a pouty face at the dead frog in her tray. "Oh," she said, "the poor thing." Ugh, Brady thought. He couldn't wait to accidentally splatter frog guts on her. The bell rang, but instead of letting his students get to it, Mr. Goff launched into a droning lecture. He went over all the instructions and warnings, and that he had covered the day before. And he reminded the class 4 times that the scalpels in their trays were really sharp. Wrap it up, Brady thought. Finally, Mr. Goff wound down and said, "You may begin." Brady snapped on his rubber gloves, and Julie's hand shut up. "Mr. Goff," she said, "I don't think we should do this." And Brady sighed. "And why is that?" Mr. Goff said. "Because it's cruel," Julie said. "These frogs are innocent." Innocent? Such a weirdo. Mr. Goff rubbed his chin. "Julie," he said, "I know this is hard for you, but the frogs won't feel a thing. I promise. Besides, if you don't dissect the frog, it will have died for nothing, and you won't get credit for this assignment." Julie sank into her chair. Brady smiled, and he picked up his scalpel. "Take that," he thought. "But," Julie pointed at the frog in her tray, "my frog's eyes are open. I can't dissect something that's looking at me. It's just wrong." Brady leaned over and saw Julie was right. Her frog's eyes were open. So were the eyes on his frog. They shone wet and glassy and dark. "Julie," Mr. Goff sighed, "that frog isn't looking at you. It isn't watching, and it can't see a thing. Okay?" He tapped his watch. "You need to get started." "Yeah," Brady whispered. "Toughen up." She shot him a look. "How would you like it," she said, "if you were the one on the tray?" Her eyes flared. A heat seemed to come from them. "I wouldn't mind a bit," he said, "because then I wouldn't be talking to you." Julie frowned. "We'll see," she said, and her eyes flared again. She shot him a wild-eyed look Brady had never seen before, not in all the years he'd known her since first grade. Her pupils seemed to shrink to a fine point and then flare back up to their normal size. So weird. Brady ignored her and pushed up his sleeves. Leave it to stupid Julie Simmons to make the one good day in biology class less fun. Sure, the frogs' eyes were open, but so what? It wasn't like their eyes were working like Mr. Goff said. The frogs were dead. Dead? Dead. Dead. To prove the point, Brady brought the scalpel close to the frog's eyes. He formed a plan. He would call Julie's name when she looked. He would then jab the blade into the frog's pupil. That'll teach her, and her reaction would be priceless. She'd probably scream. She might even gag. His scalpel blade shone as it gently brushed the frog's eye. But before he could call Julie's name and jab his own eye started to itch. Like something was in it, an eyelash or a bit of dust. He blinked and squinted, but the itch wouldn't go away. He dropped his scalpel and rubbed his eye with his wrist. After a few seconds, the itch finally faded. Next to him, Julie slowly pulled on her gloves and picked up her scalpel. "Sorry, Froggy," she said into her tray. "I have to do this." With a wince and one eye closed, she made her first incision. Brady clicked his tongue at her. Weirdo, weirdo, weirdo. He brought his own scalpel down to the frog's chest, pressing into the soft flesh of the frog's lower belly. He broke the skin and an ooze of clear liquid seeped out. Slowly, he sliced a straight line up the neck. Suddenly, he felt a prickle on his own stomach and a hard scratch, like a sharp fingernail running up to his sternum. He dropped his scalpel, and it clattered noisily onto the tray, and he stood back, pushing his chair with a loud screech. He rubbed his chest. Heartburn, he told himself. The pizza bombs. He'd eaten too fast. He'd been too excited about biology class, and now his insides were shifting. That's what he was feeling. Normal. Everyday heartburn. From too much pepperoni and sausage. That was all. "Are you okay?" Julie said. It might seem like for a second she might have smiled. "You look like you might be sick." "I'm fine," he said. "Did someone say sick?" said Mr. Goff, walking over. "Kids have thrown up during this before. If you need a break, Brady, that's fine." A few kids around him snickered. "Brady's gonna puke," someone whispered. "I'm okay," Brady said loudly, and he picked his scalpel back up. "I'm all right." He went back to work. Slowly, he peeled open his frog's chest, and the frog's organs came into view. The liver, the intestines, and the heartburn in his own chest swelled and spread, and he began to sweat from it just a little. Why did this have to happen today? Next to him, Julie smiled again. "What are you so happy about?" he said, pressing his gloved hand to his chest. "I thought you hated this assignment." She didn't answer, but her smile stood plastered on her face. Brady tried to remember what to do next. Remove the liver? The lungs? The pain in his own chest kept swelling, and it began to cloud his mind. Everything was foggy. A bead of sweat trickled down his forehead, and he poked the scalpel into the open chest cavity and shifted the liver and lungs. His own chest rumbled, his breath catching in his throat. Next to him, Julie stopped working. "Having problems?" she said. He didn't answer. He shifted the frog's organs again and grimaced. Then he saw it. The heart. He wanted it. He wanted to be the mad scientist. Julie Simmons and his stupid heartburn were ruining everything. But now he'd roll the heart between his fingers and he'd hold it in front of Julie's face. That would wipe her smile away. Maybe he'd even press the heart into her cheek or toss it in her hair. He gripped the scalpel and, pushing through the pain in his chest, jabbed the blade down like a spear. He hit the frog's heart right in the center. The pain in his chest exploded. He fell to the ground and couldn't breathe. He tried to scream, but nothing came out. Julie stood over him and he pointed up to his stripe. The scalpel in the frog's chest stuck up like a small flag. He knew what was happening. He needed Julie to get the scalpel to take it from the frog's heart. "Take it out!" he tried to tell her, but the words wouldn't come. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't work either. Suddenly, there was buzzing all around him, and Mr. Goff was pushing students away, shouting, "Get back! Give him air!" and after a few seconds called the nurse. Then everything became fuzzy and muffled and he was underwater. I don't know what happened, he heard Julie saying. Then her words seemed to be coming from far away. He just fell down and grabbed his chest. And then the world darkened and he passed out from the pain. It took the paramedics 11 minutes to arrive. When they did, they loaded Brady onto a stretcher and wheeled him quickly out of the classroom. We'll take good care of him, one burly paramedic called as they pushed Brady out the door. The second he was gone, the classroom buzzed. Wouldn't stop twitching, said a student in the back. I've never seen a face like that, said another. He kept grabbing at his chest, said a girl who sat up front. Kids have heart attacks? Finally, Mr. Goff clapped his hands. I'm sure Brady will be fine, he said. And then he told the students to return to their work. Julie raised her hand. Can I clean up Brady's desk for him, she asked. It's the least I could do. Mr. Goff nodded. Of course, Julie, he said. That's very kind. Julie picked up Brady's tray. The scalpel stuck out of his frog's chest at a funny angle, like a javelin in the ground. Sorry, Froggy, Julie whispered, but he needs to learn. And she left the scalpel in the frog's heart. She covered the tray with a sheet of plastic that Mr. Goff brought her. Then she slid the whole thing into the supply closet. She'd remove the scalpel, she told herself when the time was right. She just couldn't bring herself to leave it in the poor frog's heart forever. But Brady was a stubborn boy. She closed the supply closet and returned to her seat, where she gently stroked her own half-dissected frog. It would take him days, maybe weeks, to learn his lesson. That weirdo. The end. Hopefully you'll look at your own dissection a little bit differently and wonder, maybe you could have been that very frog. Thanks for watching. Bye.